Daniel Carter built his career on words, fast words, sharp words, constant words. In meetings, he filled silence before anyone else could. On calls, he answered questions before they were fully asked. During presentations, he explained ideas from every possible angle, afraid that if even one detail stayed unsaid, someone might doubt him. Most people saw confidence. Inside, it was something else. A quiet fear that if he ever stopped talking, people might realize he wasn't as impressive as he sounded. Daniel was 32, a senior operations manager at a growing logistics company in Chicago. On paper, he was doing well: promotions, respect, a comfortable apartment overlooking the river. But something strange kept happening in meetings. The people who influenced decisions the most spoke the least. There was one executive in particular, Mark Sullivan. Late 40s, calm, observant. During meetings, Mark rarely spoke more than a few sentences. Sometimes he stayed silent for long stretches, while others debated, argued, or defended their ideas. Then suddenly, he would ask one quiet question, and the entire room would shift. Conversations slowed. People reconsidered their assumptions. Decisions changed direction. Daniel couldn't understand it. He talked 5 times more than Mark. Yet when Mark spoke, people leaned forward. When Daniel spoke, people nodded politely and waited for him to finish. At first, Daniel blamed hierarchy. Mark was senior leadership. Of course, people listened. But over time, Daniel noticed something uncomfortable. Even junior employees listened more carefully to Mark. It wasn't authority. It was something else. Something Daniel couldn't name. The moment that forced him to confront it happened on a Tuesday morning strategy meeting. The company was reviewing a supply chain expansion plan Daniel had spent weeks preparing. Slides were polished, data was airtight. He had rehearsed the entire explanation. When the meeting started, Daniel began presenting exactly as planned. He explained the model, the assumptions, the cost projections. Every time someone raised a concern, he responded immediately, clarified the numbers, defended the reasoning, filled every pause before anyone else could step in. 40 minutes later, he finished. The room was quiet. Then Mark Sullivan spoke. Just one sentence. "What problem are we solving with this expansion?" Daniel blinked. The question wasn't hostile, but suddenly the room felt different. The CFO leaned back. Another executive glanced at the data again. Someone asked whether customer demand actually required expansion yet. Within 10 minutes, the entire proposal shifted. Not rejected, but reframed. Daniel sat there watching the conversation evolve around him. All his explanations suddenly felt excessive. After the meeting ended, he walked back to his office with a strange heaviness in his chest. He had spoken for 40 minutes. Mark had spoken for 9 seconds, and Mark had more influence. That night, Daniel replayed the meeting in his mind. Over and over. Something became painfully clear. Talking more hadn't made him more persuasive. It had made him predictable. When someone speaks constantly, their words lose weight. They become background noise. The next morning, Daniel noticed something else. During a team check-in, one of his analysts began explaining a project delay. Daniel instinctively interrupted halfway through the explanation to offer a solution. The analyst nodded politely, but a few seconds later, Daniel realized something. He hadn't even heard the full problem. His brain had rushed ahead to prove usefulness. That afternoon, he opened a blank page in his notebook and wrote a sentence that felt strangely uncomfortable. "For the next 30 days, I will speak only when my words improve the silence." It sounded simple, but Daniel immediately understood the real challenge. Silence exposes ego. Talking hides it. The rule meant he would have to sit inside uncomfortable pauses, resist the urge to prove intelligence, let conversations breathe instead of controlling them. The experiment started the next morning. First meeting of the day. Operations update. Normally, Daniel would lead most of the conversation. Instead, he listened. One manager described a delay in warehouse shipments. Daniel instantly saw the problem and the solution. His mouth almost opened automatically, but the sentence from his notebook echoed in his mind. "Speak only when your words improve the silence." He stayed quiet. 30 seconds passed. Another team member asked a clarifying question, then another. Within 2 minutes, the group identified the same solution Daniel had planned to say. But something about it felt different. The idea belonged to the room. Not to him. And strangely, the team seemed more energized, solving it together. Later that day, Daniel reviewed what had happened. The silence hadn't slowed progress. It had improved it. People thought more deeply when they had space. Over the next week, Daniel began noticing patterns he had completely missed before. Who truly understood problems. Who simply repeated confident phrases. Who hesitated before answering difficult questions. Silence sharpened his observation. But the hardest part wasn't staying quiet. It was fighting the internal voice that kept whispering the same thing. You're disappearing. In one meeting, a colleague presented an idea Daniel strongly disagreed with. Normally, he would interrupt immediately with counterarguments. Instead, he listened. 5 minutes passed. The room debated the idea from multiple angles. Eventually, someone else raised the exact flaw Daniel had seen earlier. The conversation corrected itself, without him. And that was when Daniel realized the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't listen to understand. They listen for their turn to speak. By refusing to rush in, Daniel was starting to hear things others missed. But the real shift hadn't happened yet, because talking less was only the surface of the rule. The deeper change was coming, and it would force Daniel to confront something far more dangerous than silence: his identity. Word count, 900. Next. The second week of the silence rule felt like stepping into a different world. The office hadn't changed, the people hadn't changed, but Daniel had, and because of that, everything sounded different. Before the experiment, meetings felt like competitions, people speaking over each other, defending ideas, trying to prove they were the sharpest voice in the room. Now Daniel noticed something he had missed for years. Most conversations weren't about solving problems. They were about protecting identity. Someone wanted to sound competent. Someone wanted to protect their department. Someone wanted to avoid admitting uncertainty. Words were armor, and armor makes noise. Once Daniel stopped wearing his own armor, he began hearing the clanking everywhere. The realization came during a product planning meeting late on a Wednesday afternoon. The room was debating whether to rush a new logistics tracking feature into production. Engineers argued about timelines. Product managers pushed for speed. Marketing promised clients an aggressive launch date. Voices overlapped. Arguments repeated. Everyone sounded confident. But Daniel noticed something strange. No one was actually answering the same question. People were defending positions, not exploring reality. Old Daniel would have jumped in immediately. He would have explained the operational risks, presented alternative timelines, filled the air with structured logic. But the rule still stood. Speak only when your words improve the silence. So he waited. 10 minutes passed. 15. The conversation circled the same arguments again and again. Daniel felt the familiar pressure rising inside his chest, the urge to prove value, the instinct to rescue the meeting with a clever framework. Then he remembered the second part of the silence rule he had written days earlier. Delay reaction. Your first thought protects ego. Your second thought observes reality. So he kept listening. Eventually, a junior engineer spoke up quietly. I think the real issue isn't the timeline, she said. It's that we haven't tested the data sync at scale yet. The room paused. For the first time in 20 minutes, someone had touched the real problem. The conversation shifted instantly. Engineers began discussing infrastructure limits. Product managers reconsidered launch promises. Marketing adjusted expectations. Daniel hadn't said a word, but he had watched the truth surface on its own. And something powerful clicked in his mind. Silence doesn't just reduce noise. It creates space for truth. After that meeting, Daniel wrote a second rule in his notebook. Ask before telling. Statements close thinking. Questions open it. The next time he tested the idea came 2 days later, during a financial planning review. A heated discussion had started around rising transportation costs. Department heads blamed fuel prices, regional inefficiencies, supplier contracts. Everyone had explanations. None of them matched. Daniel listened for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. Then he asked a single question. Which of these costs actually changed first? The room fell quiet. Someone opened a spreadsheet. Another analyst checked historical data. Within minutes, they discovered the real cause. A routing algorithm update, implemented 3 months earlier, had unintentionally increased empty return trips for several shipping lanes. The solution appeared almost immediately. Adjust the routing logic. Reduce unnecessary backhaul routes. Problem solved. As the meeting ended, the CFO stopped Daniel in the hallway. "You're asking better questions lately," she said. Daniel smiled slightly, because the truth was different. He wasn't asking smarter questions. He was simply speaking after thinking. But the experiment wasn't smooth every day. Silence came with a cost. On the 18th day of the rule, Daniel attended a leadership call with the company's executive team. They were discussing international expansion opportunities. The conversation moved quickly, bouncing between markets, timelines, and investment levels. Daniel had strong opinions about the strategy, but he waited, listening, analyzing. The moment to speak never quite arrived. The call ended, and Daniel felt something uncomfortable creeping into his mind. Had he waited too long? Influence requires timing. Silence without precision can look like hesitation. For the first time since starting the rule, doubt appeared. Was he becoming invisible? That night he walked along the Chicago River, replaying the call in his mind. The city lights reflected across the water, while his thoughts moved in circles. Talking too much weakens your voice, but talking too little removes it completely. Somewhere between noise and silence was the real skill. Daniel stopped walking and pulled out his phone. He opened the notebook where the silence rule began. Under the first two principles, he added a third. Speak once, not repeatedly, not defensively. One clear sentence delivered after careful listening. Because when words are rare, they carry weight. And that realization changed the way he approached the final week of the experiment. Silence was never meant to erase his voice. It was meant to sharpen it. But the real test of that principle was coming. And it would happen in a room where every word carried consequences. The final week of the silence rule didn't begin with confidence. It began with pressure. Daniel walked into the Monday executive meeting, knowing the decision on the table could reshape the company's future. The leadership team was debating whether to expand operations into 3 new international markets within the next year. Millions of dollars, hundreds of employees, and a timeline that felt aggressive. The conference room carried the quiet tension of big decisions. Laptops open, coffee cups half full, data dashboards glowing across the screen at the front of the room. Daniel took his seat near the end of the table. For the first 15 minutes, the conversation moved quickly. Market forecasts, revenue projections, competitive advantages. Everyone seemed energized by the opportunity. Optimism filled the air. But something about it felt slightly rehearsed. Daniel listened, not just to what was being said, to what wasn't. The CFO presented financial projections showing strong growth potential in the new regions. Marketing outlined demand signals from overseas partners. Operations leaders explained how new warehouses could scale within 12 months. Every slide supported the same narrative. Expansion made sense. Still, Daniel felt a faint hesitation somewhere in the discussion, a small gap between confidence and certainty. He stayed quiet. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The CEO eventually turned toward him. "Daniel, you've been listening for a while. What's your perspective?" 20 executives shifted their attention toward him. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel would have launched straight into analysis. Multiple angles, data points, a long explanation designed to demonstrate mastery. But the silence rule had rewired something deeper. He paused, just long enough to think clearly. Then he asked a single question. What happens if the regulatory approval takes 12 months instead of 6? The room fell still. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a speech. Just a question. The head of international operations leaned forward slightly. "That would delay warehouse openings," she said carefully. Daniel nodded once and stayed silent. The pause stretched across the table like a ripple in water. The CFO reopened the financial model. Someone from legal began discussing potential compliance reviews in 2 of the target countries. Another executive mentioned political uncertainty affecting trade permits. Within minutes, the conversation transformed. The expansion plan wasn't abandoned, but it was redesigned. Instead of launching in 3 markets simultaneously, the team proposed a phased rollout. 1 region first. Smaller infrastructure investment. Real-world testing before scaling further. The risk dropped dramatically. The decision felt smarter. When the meeting ended, the CEO caught up with Daniel in the hallway. "You said one sentence in that meeting," he said. "But it changed the direction of the discussion." Daniel smiled slightly, because the truth felt different inside his mind. The sentence didn't create the insight. Silence uncovered it. That evening, Daniel returned to his apartment overlooking the river. The city lights shimmered across the water as traffic hummed quietly below. He opened the notebook where the 30-day silence rule began. The first line stared back at him. Speak only when your words improve the silence. At the time, it had sounded like a communication trick. Now it felt like something much deeper. A shift in identity. For most of his life, Daniel believed influence came from constant visibility, fast responses, confident explanations, always having something to say. But the experiment revealed something few people notice. Talking is easy, thinking is rare. When you remove the pressure to speak constantly, your attention sharpens. You begin noticing hesitation in someone's voice, the assumptions hiding behind confident statements, the problems people avoid saying out loud. Silence becomes a lens. And once you see through that lens, conversations change forever. Daniel closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. The real lesson of the 30-day silence rule wasn't about becoming quiet. It was about becoming deliberate. Pause before reacting. Observe before explaining. And when you finally speak, say only what moves the conversation forward. Because in a world where everyone is racing to be heard, restraint becomes power. The loudest voice rarely leads the room. The clearest voice does, and clarity grows in silence. So if you decide to try the silence rule yourself, understand what you are actually practicing. You are not suppressing your voice. You are strengthening it. You are training yourself to think before speaking, to ask before asserting, to contribute with precision instead of noise. At first it will feel uncomfortable. Your ego will whisper that you are disappearing, but something else is happening beneath that discomfort. You are building authority, the kind that doesn't rely on volume, the kind that doesn't fight for attention, the kind that commands it naturally. Because when someone speaks rarely, people listen carefully, and when your words finally arrive, they land with weight. So the next time you enter a meeting, a conversation, or any room where opinions collide, remember this simple rule. You don't need more words, you need better ones. And better words are born from silence. Become the person who listens longer than everyone else, who thinks deeper than everyone else, who speaks only when the moment truly demands it, because the moment your words start improving the silence, the room will begin improving around you.